duchy, with a view of bestowing it upon some favourite of his own, in which case he might confine young William in one of his castles, in an honourable but still rigid and hopeless captivity, or treacherously destroy his life by the secret administration of poison. These latter counsels prevailed. Allen and the nobles who were with him sent an embassage to the court of King Henry to bring William home. Henry made objections and difficulties. This alarmed the nobles. They feared that it would prove true that Henry himself had designs on Normandy. They sent a new embassage with demands more urgent than before. Finally, after some time spent in negotiations and delays, King Henry concluded to yield, and William set out on his return. He was now about 12 or 13 years old. His military tutor, Thorold, accompanied him, and he was attended likewise by the ambassadors whom Allen had sent for him, and by a strong escort for his protection by the way. He arrived in safety at Allen's headquarters. William's presence in Normandy had the effect which had been anticipated from it. It awakened everywhere a great deal of enthusiasm in his favour. The soldiers were pleased to see how handsome their young commander was in form, and how finely he could ride. He was, in fact, a very superior equestrian for one so young. He was more fond even than other boys of horses, and as of course the most graceful and the fleetest horses which could be found were provided for him, and as Thorold had given him the best and most complete instruction, he made a fine display as he rode swiftly through the camp, followed by veteran nobles, splendidly dressed and mounted, and happy to be in his train, while his own countenance beamed with a radiance in which native intelligence and beauty were heightened by the animation and excitement of pride and pleasure. In respect to the command of the army, of course the real power remained in Allen's hands, but everything was done in William's name. And in respect to all external marks and symbols of sovereignty, the beautiful boy seemed to possess the supreme command. And as the sentiment of loyalty is always the strongest when the object which calls for the exercise of it is most helpless or frail, Allen found his power very much increased when he had this beautiful boy to exhibit as the true and rightful heir, in whose name and for whose benefit all his power was held. Still, however, the country was very far from becoming settled. The Earl of Ark kept the field, and other claimants too strengthened themselves in their various castles and towns, as if preparing to resist. In those days every separate district of the country was almost a separate realm, governed by its own baron, who lived with his retainers, within his own castle walls, and ruled the land around him with a rod of iron. These barons were engaged in perpetual quarrels among themselves, each plundering the dominions of the rest, or making hostile incursions into the territories of a neighbour to revenge some real or imaginary wrong. This turbulence and disorder prevailed everywhere throughout Normandy at the time of William's return. In the general confusion, William's government scarcely knew who were his friends or his enemies. At one time, when a deputation was sent to some of the barons in William's name, summoning them to come with their forces and join his standard, as they were in duty bound to do, they felt independent enough to send back word to him that they had too much to do in settling their own quarrels to be able to pay any attention to his. In the course of a year or two, moreover, and while his own realm continued in this unsettled and distracted state, William became involved in what was almost a quarrel with King Henry himself. When he was 15 years old, which was 2 or 3 years after his return from Paris to Normandy, Henry sent directions to William to come to a certain town called Evreux, situated about half way between Falaise and Paris, and just within the confines of Normandy, to do homage to him there for his duchy. There was some doubt among William's counsellors whether it would be most prudent to obey or disobey this command. They finally concluded that it was best to obey. Grand preparations were accordingly made for the expedition, and when all was ready, the young duke was conducted in great state, and with much pomp and parade, to meet his sovereign. The interview between William and his sovereign, and the ceremonies connected with it, lasted some days. In the course of this time, William remained at Evreux, and was in some sense, of course, in Henry's power. William having been so long in Henry's court, as a mere boy, accustomed all the time to look up and to obey Henry as a father, regarded him somewhat in that light now, and approached him with great deference and respect. Henry received him in a somewhat haughty and imperious manner, as if he considered him still under the same subjection as heretofore. William had a fortress or castle on the frontiers of his dukedom toward Henry's dominions. The name of the castle was Tellières, and the governor of it was a faithful old soldier named de Crespin. William's father, Robert, had entrusted de Crespin with the command of the castle, and given him a garrison to defend it. Henry now began to make complaint to William in respect to this castle. The garrison, he said, were continually making incursions into his dominions. William replied that he was very sorry that there was cause for such a complaint. He would inquire into it, and if the fact were really so, he would have the evil immediately corrected. Henry replied that that was not sufficient. "You must deliver the castle up to me," he said, "to be destroyed." William was indignant at such a demand, but he was so accustomed to obey implicitly whatever King Henry might require of him, that he sent the order to have the castle surrendered. When, however, the order came to de Crespin, the governor of the castle, he refused to obey it. The fortress, he said, had been committed to his charge by Robert, Duke of Normandy, and he should not give it up to the possession of any foreign power. When this answer was reported to William and his counsellors, it made them still more indignant than before at the domineering tyranny of the command, and more disposed than ever to refuse obedience to it. Still William was in a great measure in the monarch's power. On cool reflection, they perceived that resistance would then be vain. New and more authoritative orders were accordingly issued for the surrender of the castle. De Crespin now obeyed. He gave up the keys and withdrew with his garrison. William was then allowed to leave Evreux and return home, and soon afterwards the castle was razed to the ground. This affair produced, of course, a great deal of animosity and irritation between the governments of France and Normandy, and where such a state of feeling exists between two powers separated only by an imaginary line running through a populous and fertile country, aggressions from one side and from the other are sure to follow. These are soon succeeded by acts of retaliation and revenge, leading in the end to an open and general war. It was so now. Henry marched his armies into Normandy, seized towns, destroyed castles, and where he was resisted by the people, he laid waste the country with fire and sword. He finally laid siege to the very castle of Falaise. William and his government were for a time nearly overwhelmed with the tide of disaster and calamity. The tide turned, however, at length, and the fortune of war inclined in their favour. William rescued the town and castle of Falaise. It was in a very remarkable manner, too, that this exploit was accomplished. The fortress was closely invested with Henry's forces, and was on the very eve of being surrendered. The story is that Henry had offered bribes to the governor of the castle to give it up to him, and that the governor had agreed to receive them and to betray his trust. While he was preparing to do so, William arrived at the head of a resolute and determined band of Normans. They came with so sudden an onset upon the army of besiegers as to break up their camp and force them to abandon the siege. The people of the town and the